Hi everyone, I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel, and this is One on One, Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Welcome back to Matan's One-on-One podcast. Today's episode is dedicated in memory of Moshe Bina, the son of Rabbanit Malka Bina and Rabbi Aaron Bina, who passed away this past Hoshana Rabbah. If you would like to sponsor a podcast episode in honor or in memory of a loved one, please contact the Matan office via telephone or email us at podcast@matan.org.il. That's podcast@matan.org.il. A few upcoming events at Matan. There's a new series beginning on Sefer Yoshua with Dr. Yael Ziegler that will be happening on Mondays at 8 p.m. Israel time and 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And another new series will be taught by Rabbanit Surla Rosen on Moshe Rabbeinu. There'll be 6 classes beginning on February 14th at 10:50 a.m. These can be accessed through the internet, also in live. And so I encourage you to look at the Matan website to see more of the events going on. And lastly, the second semester has just begun at Matan, and it's not too late to register. Please visit our website, matan.org.il, for more information and registration. Now back to the podcast. Each week, we spend 30 minutes speaking about a seminal figure or idea on that week's Parsha. Today, I have the pleasure of sitting down with Matan faculty member Tanya White to speak about Parshat Tisa. Tanya, it's great to be sitting here with you again.
It's brilliant to be back, Yosefa, with you.
Okay, so let's take us in. This is obviously one of the most seminal parshiot certainly in Sefer Shmot. I would say the biggest event since we managed to get out of Egypt. And I'm really curious to hear what you have to say about the parsha.
So I've always found the event of the Egel fascinating. It kind of beckons us to think about or to question how could it be that there's people who have just witnessed miracles in front of their eyes, the splitting of the sea and the makot and all the various things that we read about, could have all of a sudden built a seemingly idol, or an idol that looks like an idol, after having witnessed everything they saw. And it really made me think a lot about why that would be, what kind of mindset those people would have been in to have done that, and maybe even to question the very basis of what exactly they were doing when they built the Egel. What did the Egel represent? A few years ago, a friend of mine introduced me to the workings of the German Jewish psychologist, social psychologist and psychoanalyst, Erich Fromm. Actually, the original book I read was called Religion and Psychoanalysis, which was absolutely phenomenal. And then I started looking at a bit more at his works, and I read a book that totally shifted the way I understood not just the episode of the Egel, of the golden calf, but generally the whole narrative of the people coming out of Egypt and the whole narrative of Moshe at the burning bush. And it, in some ways, actually, I have to say that the book itself transformed the way I looked at my own reality. It's very rare that a book kind of sits with you for so long after you read it. And that was one of those books. And the book is called To Have and To Be. It's a book about the way in which we approach reality, the way in which we approach our lives. And what I would love to do, Yosefa, is to actually outline the idea in the book first before I apply it or show you how he applies it actually to the episode of the golden calf. Now, I know that perhaps it's not it's not a classic commentator on the Torah. One wouldn't necessarily look to Erich Fromm to kind of elicit some kind of meaning from the Torah text. But I have to say that for me, it has been immensely formative in reading, again, not just this narrative of the Egel and Tisa, but many other narratives in the text.
You know, Tanya, after you outline the ideas, I would love to circle back to that question later of why do you think, and here I'll give you time to think about it, why Why do you think that it was so transformative for you? What was it about this idea particularly?
Okay, so I mean, I think as we talk, it'll be illustrated through what I'm saying.
Okay.
But I'll definitely circle back to it afterwards as well. Mm-hmm. Just a little bit of background on Erich Fromm. He lived from 1900 to 1980. He originally was from Germany, from Frankfurt, and he managed to escape to America, where he resided afterwards. He lived the rest of his life. His PhD, his doctorate, actually was on Jewish law, interestingly enough.
That is surprising.
Yeah, really surprising. Well, not so surprising, actually, when you read his books, funnily enough. But he, obviously, his training and his profession was as a psychoanalyst. And he wrote a lot. He wrote many books. At the end, I'll perhaps recommend you 3 of which I personally really kind of identify with. But I really recommend people reading. They're not long. All of them are quite short, actually. And they are very, very edifying, I think, anyway. So let me talk about to have and to be. So he speaks about the idea that we approach the world in 2 different ways. One is through the mode of having, and one is through the mode of being. And he actually begins by, and I'd like to just share this for a minute. He begins by reading or by presenting 2 different poems. And he explains that each of these poems are about flowers or about nature. And they explain or they illustrate these 2 different modes of existing in the world, the modes of existing in a having way and the mode of existing in a being way. So the first one, and they're very short, so I'll literally just very quickly read them. The first one goes like this. Flower in a crannied wall, I pluck you out of the crannies. I hold you here, root and all, in my hand. Little flower, but if I could understand what you are, root and all in all, I should know what God and man is. Okay? So, and he explains that in this poem, essentially what you're doing is you're looking at the flower or whatever it is, right? Something from nature, and you want to possess it. You want to pick it, you want to have it, you want to hold it, but by doing that, what you're actually doing is you're taking the life out of it. Okay, you're trying to possess it, you're trying to hold it, you're trying to encapsulate it, you're trying to identify it, you're trying to define it, you're putting it into a box. Then the second one, which is far shorter, goes like this. When I look carefully, I see the Nazuna blooming. It's a type of flower by the hedge. That's it.
This could be an ad for the Chevra L'Haganat Teva.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Why keep the flowers out in the fields?
Don't
pick
the
them.
Flowers.
Don't pick them.
Exactly. But I think it's so beautiful what he's saying here, because what he essentially, he obviously he unpacks it and he explains it. But he says that we as human beings, our impulse is to pluck the flower. By the way, nowadays our impulse is to video something or to take a picture of it. That's another way of possessing, right? Our impulse is to do that because when we do that, we've integrated that into ourselves in some way or another. Okay. And he says, but actually in the modes of being, that's the authentic mode. The authentic mode is to look at it, is to contemplate it, is to be with it, but not to have to possess it. Okay. Now he speaks about this obviously, and he applies it in many different forms and in many different ways to many different kind of realities or approaches to the way in which we see the world. But ultimately what he says is that the having mode, which has become prevalent today, right, and very characteristic of today's society, is where I'm convinced, and he speaks about this idea of where I'm convinced that my happiness is going to come from the mode of having, right? Self-fulfillment and acquiring. Self-fulfillment is going to come from acquiring things. And by the way, when I acquire something, it doesn't have to be something tangible and physical. Okay. He talks about acquiring knowledge through the having mode as opposed to the being mode, or love or comprehension of the world. All of these things, he speaks about the 2 different modes. The problem with the having mode or the possessing mode is that ultimately it leads to an inauthentic existence, which is hedonistic or full of greed or envy, all the negative things that society reaps. And the other mode is the being mode, where I am absolutely free. I seek things for the curiosity of those things themselves, meaning even knowledge. Love, for example. Okay, love is where I meet the other unconditionally. It reminds me very much of Buber. In fact, if we had time, which we don't, I would do a whole comparison with Buber's I, thou, I, it, because I think there's a huge comparison there, right? But it's when I'm in a being mode, I don't need to possess the other. I don't need to integrate the other. In fact, I allow the other to be, and I am, and we both are in our senses of being together without having to incorporate the other into my experience.
Okay. Now, this sounds not so dissimilar from a lot of Buddhist thought. I don't know if he was in dialogue with it or just, and I'm not a Buddhist scholar by any means, but
yeah,
this notion of being in the moment or observing reality around you. I mean, those are serious catchphrases in Buddhist theology. So I'm just curious, is there any known relationship there? I mean, I believe there's also people can come to certain truths from all different angles. It doesn't have to be, but it just sort of springs up to mind as you're speaking.
So there's no question that I also notice a parallel between, and again, he wrote this book, actually, I can't remember exactly what year it was. I'm just looking now and think this was originally published in 1976.
Right, which is also a heyday of Buddhist, Eastern practices being integrated into America.
For sure. And I think for sure he was probably influenced by it, but his argument comes from much more. I mean, he argues anyway that it comes from what he's witnessed in his clinic, in his therapy, and from how he believes one can go through some kind of cathartic. I don't know, redemption's the right word, but cathartic process, therapeutic process. And what he says he witnesses is that people that are in the having mode hold on to pain and to other things much more than people who are in the being mode. So I think that's also a really interesting observation. I'm sure he was probably influenced. I mean, there's definitely a lot of...
that's pretty classic also. That sentence also is something that really comes very strongly. Obviously, you don't allow yourself to be emotionally engaged in things when you're just observing them from afar. But then there are things where we can't help but not be, a sort of omniscient observer. Right.
So he doesn't totally negate the having experience. On the contrary, he says part of being a human being is to define. We have to define things and we have to categorize and we have to, in order to learn, that's how we learn. And actually talking about learning, it's one of my most... I hope you'll allow me to share one more thing that he says, because it's my favorite part of the book, where he differentiates between the having and the being mode when it comes to learning. And he says that in the having mode, the student comes to the lecture already with a priori knowledge, meaning already with things that he wants to get out from the lecture, things that he wants to know. And that student will write and they'll keep their notes, and their notes are going to represent exactly what they learn, but there's no integration. He says students in the having mode have but one aim: to hold on to what they learned, either by entrusting it firmly to their memories or by carefully guarding their notes. They don't have to reproduce or create something new, he said, right? And he continues, but then he says that students in the being mode, and I'm trying to find where he says it exactly. I can't find it here right now, but he says students in the being mode they come to the topic and they are processing it. They allow the knowledge to stand in and of itself. They allow themselves to be changed by what they hear, right? And it's not just in order to possess the knowledge, but for the knowledge to possess them or to affect their being. So I think that was also beautiful. I love the way he speaks about learning, because it's not your classic way of thinking about having and being, but he applies it so beautifully.
Recently I also was reading something that's related, where the writer was speaking about how university used to be a place that you went to form your character. But that nowadays it's sort of just like a supermarket for different ideas. And that, I think, it really is echoing exactly what he's saying. Right? If you're going there to form your character, you're going there to hear things and to be changed by them. You're opening up a book because you want to come out differently at the end of the book. You're going to a class because you're open to what it might do to change your ideas, your values, and how you operate in the world. So I think that that's a really powerful idea.
Yeah, so you might have read it. I read it in The Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt.
I read it somewhere else, but he was quoting him as well. So they're all related ideas.
Yeah, so, and there he talks about the idea of cancel culture and what we're losing in the universities by cancel culture, not being exposed to something that might challenge our pre-existing conceptions. And yeah, I mean, that's totally aligned with what Erich Fromm's saying here.
Okay, so let's take the having and being to the Parsha.
So what does he say about the Parsha? And he actually speaks specifically about the golden calf, which I found really, really fascinating. He talks about the process of the people of Israel coming out of Egypt. But let me just think for a second. I want us, before I even get to his explanation of the golden calf, I want us just to think about what actually happens in our Parsha. So we have the creation of the golden calf. And obviously, how is that created? It's created by the people giving their jewelry to Aaron. Then we have God telling Moshe what happened. We have Moshe coming down the mountain and taking this very tangible, very iconically represented notion of the law and of our relationship with God, the luchot, and smashing it. Okay, there's a smashing of the possession of the law or the possession of the relationship, that representation of it being smashed. We then have God calling, and this is super important, which I'm going to talk about, calling them a stiff-necked people, telling them they're not going to go into the land, the people having to drink the ashes of the egel, which is also going to be super important for our commentary here. And then finally, if you look in Perek Lamed, Perek Lamed Gimel, chapter 33, you'll notice that there's a very strange corollary after all of these events. And that is that the people keep putting on and taking off jewelry. Okay. For example, in Pasuk Zalev, Yishma Amet Advar Hara Zev Yitablu, and they mourned because they weren't going to go into Eretz Yisrael. Velo Shatu Ish Edio Alav, and each man did not put on their ornaments, their jewelry, right? And then again, afterwards, God, not only did they not put them on, but Hashem turns around and says to the people, at the second, I can't find the actual pasuk, but he turns around to people and he says that they shouldn't adorn themselves with jewelry. And then it says, and again, the people took the jewelry off. Now, again, why this obsession as a corollary to the whole story with the taking on and the taking off of jewelry, which is also something that's really important and very, very often juxtaposed to this notion or this bitui, this expression of being an amkasha or a stiff-necked people. Okay, so those are the four things that I want to kind of focus in on the Parsha, and I want to try and understand how this paradigm that we've set up of the having and the being from Erich Fromm can in some ways help us to unpack or to understand this episode in a slightly different way to the one that we may have until now understood. Let's just think for a second about the people. And this is what Erich Fromm himself really speaks about. So I want to explain to you what he says, and then I want to add on a bit more of how I have expanded this idea slightly. So he speaks about this idea that the people of Israel lived in a society whose quintessential value was the notion of having. The whole of the Egyptian mindset, the culture, was this idea of having, so much so that they were even buried with their possessions. Sometimes they were even buried with their family alive. Okay, the highest level of the pyramid, right, both in a metaphorical and a literal sense, was of having, of being the wealthiest, the person with the most possessions. Okay, and the people of Israel, when they moved from being in that society, inside the Egyptian society, to becoming Israelites Israelite wanderers in the desert is exactly that movement from a society of having to a society of being, or from an existence of having to an existence of being. And when they move to freedom, in a sense, they have to not just become free in the classic form that we understand it, but they actually have to repossess themselves. They have to learn a new language in which to communicate with themselves, with others, with God. They have to be taught that possession and ownership is not what defines relationships. Now, again, if we don't have time now, but if we look at the episode of Moshe by the burning bush, it's the same idea. Moshe all the time wants to define God. If you look back, he says to God, "Mashimcha, what's your name? And how am I going to call you? And how am I going to define you?" And what's Hashem's response? Ehyeh asher ehyeh. I will be what I will be. Hashem is pushing Moshe to make a paradigm shift from a mindset of having to a mindset of being.
If I can add one note there, Tanya, which is also the taking off the shoes, which if you look at it just in the biblical context is what is classically done when someone is in a holy place. Shoes are thought, but it also, wearing shoes separates you from fully inhabiting the space that you're in. There's a lot of really fascinating Hasidic ideas surrounding this, and it's also not a coincidental that people, when you're practicing yoga, if I can go back to the slightly Buddhist thing, right? You're not wearing shoes because shoes separate you from being fully present in the moment. They always talk about being rooted. So Moshe having to take off his shoes, which again, totally on one level is about connecting to a holy place, but it's because when you're wearing shoes, you have a barrier between you and that space.
Wow, that's so beautiful, Yosef. I love that. But let me go back to our Parshat Tisa. So here, Aaron, remember, Moshe's understood that paradigm shift from the burning bush. He's made that paradigm shift. He's left the having society. He's been in the desert, etc. But the people of Israel haven't. And Aaron himself hasn't. And when the people come to Aaron and they say, we've lost our leader, we want to create a new leader, the only representation of reality that they know is one of having. Aaron also, by the way. And therefore, when they say to Aaron, we're going to bring you our jewelry and you're going to build something for us from that, that's a muvan me'elav. That's an obvious thing for them. It's not, and many of the commentators, obviously Erich Fromm is not the first to say this in terms of the fact that the Egel, what didn't represent them idol worshipping, the Egel represented them trying to fill in the void that had been left when Moshe went up the mountain, the void that had been left when God wasn't creating miracles in front of their eyes. They were trying to fill that void in the only way that they knew how, and that was through the mode of having. The second thing that I think is, and by the way, I'll just read for you very, very briefly what Erich Fromm himself says. Okay, it's so beautiful. The history of the Exodus moves to a tragic end. The Hebrews cannot bear to live without having. Although they can live without a fixed abode and without food, except that sent by God every day, they cannot live without a visible, present leader. Thus, when Moses disappears on the mountain, the desperate Hebrews get Aaron to make them a visible manifestation of something they can worship, the golden calf. So that is what it is. It's the having, because that is the only mode of existence that they understand. And therefore, it's no surprise that when Moshe comes down the mountain, instead of bringing the luchot down to them, luchot being representative or manifestation of the covenant between the people of Israel and God, he smashes the luchot. And by the way, it's not a smashing. It's not an impulsive smashing. Moshe knew exactly what was happening. He saw it already from on high. The smashing of the luchot was purposeful. Yeah. He came down and he purposely smashes it because it represents the smashing. In Erich Fromm's language, it represents the movement from a relationship of having to a relationship of being. Now, it's no surprise, Yosefa, obviously, what does it remind you of that they have to drink the ashes of the Egel? Who else had to drink ashes? The Sotah.
The Sotah.
Right.
Right. Chazal pick up on that.
Chazal pick up on that, everyone, and the Midrash picks up on that, obviously. Okay, the Midrash, in a very powerful way, picks up on that idea. But why do they have to drink it? So again, it goes back, and by the way, Erich Fromm speaks about this, the idea of consumerism. Consumerism is a society whose highest, the pinnacle of society, okay, is the having mode. That's what consumerism is. When I want to consume everything I see. Okay, it doesn't mean I want to literally eat it, but that's what it is. In a sense, when we are told that they have to consume the calf, it reminds us of the sotah. What's the sotah? The woman who has harloted herself. And what's the book in Tanakh where we see this represented in the best way possible? Hosea. Okay, remember God calls on Hosea and says, you want to know what it feels like to be cheated on, like the people have cheated on me? Go and marry a harlot, go and marry a prostitute, and then you'll see what it feels like. And the most beautiful, beautiful idea that comes out from that is the idea where Hashem turns around to the people of Israel, basically, through Hosea, and says, Tikri'i ishi v'lo tikri'i li od bali. Call me your husband, don't call me your owner. Right? That's what he needs to teach the people. That the Isha Sotah reminds us that of a situation where a husband and wife exist in a relationship of having rather than being. Of
an ownership rather than a partnership.
Of ownership, exactly.
Rather than a partnership. In a partnership, you can be.
Beautiful, exactly.
But where one owns the other in that kind of agreement, you don't have space for that kind of relationship.
Exactly. And it goes back to Buber, right? You're looking at the other as an object rather than a subject, as an it, as a means to an end, rather than a thou.
I have a question, Tanya. How do we see that as a story continues? Meaning, ultimately, Moshe comes down with another set of luchot. So what does Fromm see in the continuation of the narrative that proves that they're now being?
So it's very interesting. Fromm himself, he actually goes through, it's so beautiful. He goes through the whole of the Jewish history, and he goes through that the generation of the slaves, they existed in that mode of having, that it took till the next generation and went into Eretz Yisrael. And by the way, he even speaks about Eretz Yisrael. That Eretz Yisrael is also this idea of possessing the land. But if we don't remember that we are not the ultimate possessors, that God is the ultimate possessor, and we don't live in a mode of being in the land, then we're thrown out the land. And he speaks about the destruction of the temple, and he speaks about the rabbinic age. He even speaks about the New Testament. He goes through the whole thing, and he basically shows how we're meant to be balancing these two notions of having and being. And that Dafka, that the Bible, that the Old Testament, he calls it, is really a lesson in the ability to exist in a mode of being, and not just in a mode of having, meaning a mode of having is still important, right? But to be able to surpass that and to be able to at some point lead a more authentic life, as he calls it, which would be in the mode of being. I just want to add one more thing to the idea of the drinking of the ashes, because I think it's really, really important, is that in a way, what the message that Moshe's, or Hashem really, is giving to the people by consuming is that they shouldn't be consumed, right? That they shouldn't be that which consumed them, meaning the building of the golden calf and the whole having mindset. They have to consume that. They have to integrate that into, it's got to be something within, not just something outside. When I possess something, I'm possessing it externally, but it's also got to be something internally. They have to internalize the message of the golden calf. I think that's really kind of the important idea. So the corollary of the story that I mentioned about them taking the jewelry off and putting the jewelry off and God telling them to take the jewelry off is obviously a corollary to that idea of having and being. That there's a time and a place for ornamentation, and this was not the time. The time for them was to take off all of those things that remind them of the having mode. And the final idea being called the stiff-necked people and what that represents, I find it very bizarre, that expression, Sha'oref. And I actually think, I was thinking more and more about this. Again, Erich Fromm doesn't mention it, but it seems obvious that it goes with the rest of the idea that he brings, that Sha'oref means someone that can't move their neck. They can't see beyond. They can't paradigm shift. They're not able to shift from the having mode to the being mode, which is clear that people can't. It takes the second generation. But as I was thinking about it yesterday, I was thinking even more about ancient Egypt. And if you look at all the pictures, one of the things that they wear, one of the represent the highest level of kind of kingship there is to wear what's called a nemes. I think that's how you pronounce it. Okay. Which is basically a ornamentation that you wear around your neck. And by the way, I read up on it. It begins all the way up. You almost can't move your neck at all. Okay. It begins at the top of the neck, comes all the way down to your chest, and it's ornamented. It's beautiful. It's ornate and it's gorgeous. And the highest level in society, the higher you were in society, the more ornate your nemes was. And it had lapels also that hung by the ears. So you literally couldn't move in it. And I was thinking maybe that also could perhaps be this idea of a stiff-necked people. When you're so ornamented, when you're so obsessed and you're so integrated in the having society, you can't move your neck because you have that on you. Only when you rid yourself, like you said, of the shoes and all of those things that bind us to this notion of having, when we rid all of those things, only then can we truly be in the mode of being. Can we truly exist in the mode of being? And only in that mode can we really have an authentic covenantal relationship with Hashem.
I think this idea also takes me to, and you hinted to it before, but all of the mitzvot in which we are supposed to show very literally that we are not in charge and that we do not own anything. Take it, for all the mitzvot surrounding money, right? And Shemitah and all the, what we call mitzvot rishit, where you have to give the firsts of, right? Your produce, your cattle and all of your challah, and all of those mitzvot are there. And I love that. I think that this idea, by the way, that you're expressing, I think it comes through actually in many midrashim, but I love that his language gives it a totally different side. And also I think in a way that is very relatable to our world. And you've already translated his language into consumerism. So I love how language can shift over time, and that, the kernel which can be expressed by Chazal is then brought out in a totally different way by a modern thinker. But you have, we know that Chazal and the Torah itself, I think even without Chazal, was expressing this basic idea that if you think you're in charge, you're not going to be able to have a genuine relationship with he who actually is in charge. And so, Erich Fromm is speaking about it in the sense of you have to be observing, and I would say even thankful for what you have, so that you can then have a genuine relationship with your, with God. And I would even say, by the way, on a level of a relationship with a spouse or with a loved one, is that when we think that they are in our possession, things get really, really messy. Meaning when we think that we are in control of our children, or quote unquote, they're in our possession, or when we think that way about our spouse also, relationships go totally, they skid totally off course. And it's only when people are able to be present in a relationship, in therapy world, they call it having a solid, flexible self. It's a nod to David Snarch, alav shalom. But when a person has to have their solid, flexible self, that they are in their own space and they're able to observe the other, but once they take ownership or they think that they each are fused with each other, that's when people start behaving in ways that are inappropriate because they misunderstand the nature of their relationship. So it also sort of throws me into that space as well. But I think that kernel exists in Chazal, really. But I love the language that you're giving through Erich Fromm. And it, of course, takes us to the space of general consumerism that we see has overtaken society.
Totally. By the way, just so people are aware, the mitzvot that come immediately after in the Parsha and the Parsha after talk exactly about what you're saying. You have to destroy any idol artifacts from idol worship. You can't create any molten images, redemption of the firstborn, the Bikurim. Okay, all of those come immediately after this. And by the way, Shabbat is on either side. We didn't even speak about Shabbat, but Shabbat is the ultimate mode of being. All of these things that surround, all of the laws and all of the commands that surround the Egel are all to do exactly as you said yourself, are all to do with this idea of renouncing ownership. I think that's really like kind of how I would define it. Renouncing ownership, which, as you said, creates a sense of humility. It creates a sense of being present with the other person without feeling the need to own them. And I say even more than that, it's, as you mentioned, it creates a very deep sense of gratitude. Yeah. And I think that's really what people say, why was the Bible so radical? Was it monotheism? But I think it was even more than monotheism that was so radical about the Bible. It was a totally different way of relating, not just to God, but actually to man, actually to the other and to the self. And I think Erich Fromm taps into that really beautifully through the prism of the having and the being.
Tanya, this was a really wonderful, I would even say soundbite into his theology. I guess I want to end the conversation with you just telling us really in bullet points the 3 books that you would recommend to read of his. And I'll put them in the show notes, of course.
Yeah. So firstly, To Have and To Be, obviously, I would totally recommend. The Art of, I'd say 4, The Art of Being. It's very similar to
There's always more,
Tanya. Yeah, with me, there's always more. Sorry. The Art of Being.
Yeah.
And The Art of Loving.
Yeah, that's the one that people hear about more.
So beautiful. The Art of Loving is beautiful. And I tell you, the book that took me to him is called Religion and Psychoanalysis. And I personally, it's one of my personal favorite. It may not speak to everyone, but it's also, and they're all very thin books. They're very, very reader friendly. Highly recommend.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Tanya.
Thank you, Yosefa.
I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I'm Dr. Yosefa Fogel-Rubel, and this is One-on-One Women Talk Torah, a series brought to you by Matan Women's Institute for Torah Study. Thank you to the entire Matan team for their input. Please do One-on-One and Women's Torah Learning a small favor by sharing this podcast with family and friends so that we can reach new listeners. You can stream and download these episodes on Spotify, iTunes, and Matan's website, and write us any feedback at podcast@matan.org.il. That's podcast@matan.org.il. Thanks for listening, everyone.